Hey AP Econ students, time to go over another FRQ, free response question from an old macro economics exam. Today's example is from the year 2018. So let's see what they have to say. Number 1 says, assume the United States economy is in recession. Well, there's really no ambiguity there. It's in recession, so you should automatically be thinking, well, if it's in recession, looks like I'm over here on the cold side, and let's see what they want me to do here. So part A says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand curves and show each of the following. So basically they want this little sketch here. They just want a nice, neat one, and using their labeling. So this is A. So this kind of looks like this could be some easy points here to start off. So we'll make our LROS over here, and then we'll get things intersecting over here. Okay, and so we're going to label everything. So this is our short run aggregate supply curve. This is our aggregate demand. This is quantity of real GDP. Take a little bit off the top there, and that is our LROS. This is our price level. I think we have everything we need there. And now they want us to do our current price level as PL sub 1. And the quantity as Y. So remember, your horizontal axis is GDP, and Y is the variable we use in the circular flow, so Y comes up a lot. It's also the name of the horizontal axis, which is goofy, because that contradicts some math knowledge. Okay, so there we go, we get our points there. Alright, B. Now, assume the Eurozone, a major trading partner of the US, enters into a recession. Maybe it's a global recession, but we have a trading partner that's in a recession. What will be the effect on the United States exports to the Eurozone? Well, you don't want to overthink this. You want this to be simple. Regardless of whether we're in a recession is not relevant. We have a trading partner that's in a recession. If our trading partner is in a recession, they can't afford to buy our stuff. So what winds up happening is for our aggregate demand, which is C plus I plus G plus NX. This is a question, we don't get too many of them about the exports. Well, that means that we're going to have a decrease in our net exports because they can't afford them because they're in a recession. So what's that going to do to our aggregate demand? It's going to decrease. So things aren't so good, and they're going to get worse because our friends are in recession too, our trading partner. So part B1 says, what will the effect be on the United States exports to the Eurozone? Explain. So let's see, I think we can fit this in down here. So for B1, we're going to say exports will decrease. The Eurozone in recession cannot afford to buy U.S. goods. Okay? Now they can afford some, but they can't afford the normal amount, so we're going to have a decrease. Okay, so there was our key there. All right, now for part 2, it says, on your graph in part A, show the effect of the change identified in part 1. So we just have to show a decrease in aggregate demand here. So we'll just draw a parallel line. So it looks like we're going to wind up in a deeper recession here. So I'm going to call this AD prime, and I want to make sure I have arrows showing I have a decrease here, decrease in aggregate demand. And then for part 3 it says, what will the effect be of the change identified in part 2 on unemployment in the United States? And I'll go ahead and put that up here. So this is B, part 3. And that's pretty logical that if we're in a recession and we go into a deeper recession, we're going to have even more unemployment. So because it's the word unemployment, make sure you don't accidentally say it's going to be a decrease in unemployment. That would be a good thing. It's going to be an increase in unemployment. So there's more of it. So an increase in unemployment. Okay, so now we are on to part C. Part C says, assume the Eurozone recession causes a decrease in the demand for U.S. dollars in the foreign exchange market. Well, this is a foreign exchange market question, which is not going to be on the exam. So we call that Forex if you were here. That's short for foreign exchange. And I'm just going to put not applicable for this year. And I'm going to move on to D. D says, assume the U.S. implements a combination of expansionary fiscal and monetary. So this is a really good little question here. So, all right, you see this, we're in a recession, so we need to fix it. And we know that we could fix it with fiscal policy. And you say, well, we could increase some government spending, or we could decrease some taxes. And then over here you could say, oh, we're in a recession, we'll let the Fed take care of this. And we're in a recession, the monetary policy, oh, we are going to lower the reserve ratio. We are going to lower the discount rate. We are going to, on open market operations, we are going to buy bonds. Okay, all of these things would stimulate this economy and close this gap. So what they're saying for Part D is assume the U.S. implements a combination of both of these approaches. In the absence of complete crowding out, what will be the effect of these policies on each of the following? All right, now, I don't think that this was necessary to say in the absence of complete crowding out, but that confused some students. And so the key word is complete. So let's just see if we can agree on these. Now we only have to explain the last one. So D part 1, pretty easy question. What's going to be the effect on aggregate demand? Well, all of these things are stimulating the economy to try to close the gap. So what's going to happen to aggregate demand? It's going to increase. Pretty simple. Part 2. What's going to happen to price level? Well, you guys can see, because the aggregate demand went over, price level definitely increased a little bit. So that's also going to be increase. And then part 3. What is going to be the effect of interest rates? Explain. Now, in my opinion, this is the best question on the entire thing here, because they're trying to point out to you that depending on the approach, we have a contradiction. So let's draw this over here. You are a monetary policy person, okay? Well, your graph for monetary policy is the money supply. And you're thinking, oh, well, I have to lower interest rates. How does the Fed lower interest rates? All three of these things are going to move the money supply to the right, which is going to lower interest rates. This has to be something absolutely known by every macro student. So what do we hear? Nominal interest rates here. And this is a quantity of money. Okay, and so our interest rates were here, and they went down because we increased the money supply. This is just kind of an automatic here that you get this. You lower all of these things, increase the money supply, lower interest rates, get people to borrow money, stimulate the economy. Okay? The fiscal approach, though, if you are going to cut taxes or increase government spending, what's funny is we just assume we don't have the money to do this because we don't. We're, over $20 trillion in debt. So how does the government increase government spending? Or how do they cut taxes and make up for the lack of tax revenue? Well, they have to borrow money from the loanable funds market. Now remember, the loanable funds market, the government comes in here. So this is the loanable funds market. The government comes in here as a huge demander for loans. And what do they wind up doing? Well, remember, this is real interest rates. But what they wind up doing is their huge increase in demand winds up driving up interest rates. So that's why this is a great little question. Monetary policy drives interest rates down. Fiscal policy frequently drives interest rates up. And so the question is, how does it affect interest rates? You don't know, because you have two opposite things happening. Okay? And so, let's see. We'll just cut the top off of there and fit this in here. So, what happens to interest rates? We're going to say not enough information. Or you can say unknown. We're going to say not enough info. And you're going to say, to explain, you can say monetary policy lowers interest rates. And I'll put this in over here. Fiscal policy raises interest rates. So you need more info about which one had the bigger effect. Now, question number 3 is also an example of very, very broad generalizations here, because there's a whole lot of nuance. It's a very, very deep, layered question here, but for our level, it's a simple question. So it's like, oh, we don't know, because we have a decrease and an increase going on at the same time, so we don't know. All right. So we had a typical recessionary graph from the ADAS model, fairly straightforward. And then a good little question actually affecting our net exports, because we usually were talking about C, I, and G, so this was a good little question that way. Foreign exchange, not relevant. And then a good little one contrasting how to fix the approach and what's the effect on interest rates. Okay, so there is question number 1. Let's move on to 2. All right, question number 2 says, assume the economy of Yucaland is currently at full employment. Okay, so it seems like if they're saying we're at full employment, as far as the ADAS model, it's like, okay, we're at full employment, it's all good. The government of Yucaland reduces the tax rates on households' interest earnings. Okay, so things are going fine, and whatever reason the policy is to reduce people's taxes. So question A says, what will happen to private savings? Well, it looks like they're trying to guide you toward the loanable funds market. So this will be a good review of a little scratch work over here. So remember, when you have the loanable funds market, this is all about the idea of banking and understanding that the savings is what's providing the loans for people the supply of loans is from people's savings, and that's enabling people to borrow money. So when we have a big increase in savings, for whatever reason, when people save more money, they're going to lower interest rates. So this thing would shift over here. Now, it can be a little bit misleading on this one, is it says the government of Yucaland reduces tax rates on households' interest and savings. What will happen to private savings? Or sorry, household earnings. Household interest earnings. Well, you're like, well, what's the relationship between people getting a tax break and savings? Well, the connection you're supposed to make is that whenever anyone gets an unexpected amount of cash or money, the idea is that it goes every single place the person would normally spend it. So the theory is everybody saves at least a little money, and if you give them a tax break, there's going to be more savings than normal. Now, there's probably going to be more consumption and more of everything, but the infusion of unexpected money gets distributed every place the money normally goes, therefore there'll be an increase in savings. That's the idea. And so you want to just illustrate what happens to the private savings. Actually, they just ask, what happens to private savings if you get some unexpected money? Well, private savings will increase. That's actually all they want to know is that one-word answer for part A. It'll increase. But B then says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market to show the effect of the private savings change. Well, that's going to drive down interest rates. So we're going to make a nice little graph here for part B. And I'm going have to draw two supply curves. So there was the original, and then we'll draw a parallel one. Showed an increase in supply. Alright. Alright, so here was our, we'll label this our loanable funds market. And the vertical axis is real interest rates. And here we have the quantity of loanable funds. And I'm going to have the supply of loans prime, demand for loans. Okay, and so that increase shifted us this way. And again, when you want to show the impact, you need to make sure that you show that impact over here. And I'm going to say, well, this was my original interest rate, and the increase drove it down. Okay. So, draw a correctly labeled loanable funds market, show the impact on equilibrium of the shift. Alright, so we showed that. Okay, part C. This one's a fairly short question. It says, given the real interest rate change identified in part B, that they're lower, answer the following. What's going to happen to aggregate demand? Well, that's interesting. They're kind of bringing us back to here. Well, we're going to have a spike in activity because of these low interest rates, so we're going to have a surge in aggregate demand. Might even trigger some inflation. We don't have to worry about that. But it just says show the short-run effect on aggregate demand. And we're just going to say, well, aggregate demand will increase. And this goes to this thing they're constantly referring to. Do you understand the impact of low interest rates on an economy? And why will the AD increase? We'll get our point for saying it will increase, and then we just want to, we'll do our macro shorthand, and then we'll follow it up with a sentence. And we'll say, oh, well, a decrease in interest rates leads to an increase in consumption and an increase in investment, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand. That really covers it right there, but we'll put a nice little sentence here. And we will just say low interest rates lead to an increase in this phrase they love, interest sensitive spending. Like consumption and investment. Which increase aggregate demand. Okay. So probably if you know what you're talking about, you can err on the side of writing a lot. If you're shaky on what you're talking about, don't write too much and it'll show you don't know what you're talking about. Okay? So worst case scenario, get your point for increase, and if you're shaky, just say, I know my shorthand's right. I'm worried about kind of blowing this in my explanation. Okay? But it's all about, because this is a constant thing. Interest rates are low, lead to an increase in the interest-sensitive spending, like consumption and investment, and that leads to an increase in aggregate demand, which also leads to an increase in real GDP, which also leads to an increase in long-run aggregate supply. So now let's, so that was just part one. And then part two, we'll just put this right here, I guess. Part two says, what's the long-run effect on potential real GDP in Euclid? All right, this, once again, this is such an important concept. So important. You have to have these two things down. And it's, what's the difference between a change in spending? And so I'm actually going to draw both of these. Okay, we are in equilibrium, because that's how the problem started. Okay, and so on this one, if I say there's a decrease in interest rates, and that's going to lead to an increase in consumption, versus there's a decrease in interest rates, which is going to lead to an increase in investment. This goes to this super important concept of how powerful entrepreneurs are in the equation versus just consuming more. What's going to happen on this one if you focus on just an increase in consumption? Yes, it's true that there will be an increase in consumption, and there's AD prime. And you went from here to here. But if consumption is the only thing that's driving it, then you're just going to be triggering an increase in price level, and there will be a decrease in SROS, and you're going to come back here, and you're just going to go through an inflationary cycle. So if this was SROS, SROS would actually decrease because things are getting more expensive. Versus what happens when the decrease in interest rates leads to an increase in I. Now, I want to emphasize something right here. This can be, I'm contrasting these, but I don't want there to be any confusion. There is not a decrease in interest rates that only affects consumption, but does not affect I. I'm just saying if you only discuss I, so I don't want you to be confused there. In fact, on this one, I could say, just to make sure there's no confusion, what if there was a decrease in taxes, and that led to an increase in consumption? If it's only about consumption, that's the point. We don't get economic growth. We just get little spikes in we get an increase in the economy that's temporary. Notice the economy never grew. This is the size of the economy right here. It's right here. That's how big it is. That's my long-run aggregate supply. The economy didn't get big. It just got hot for a little bit, and now it's back. But when it's business people that are spending, that is a completely different dynamic. When business people spend, when consumers go to the store and buy shirts and clothes and houses and cars and all sorts of stuff, and we're just consuming, that's great for businesses and it's great for economy. But that's nothing compared to when businesses go and they spend and they build new buildings and new restaurants and new stores, and they expand and they build new capacities to have people work. They're increasing the supply capacity. They're not just giving a hot economy, they're building new factories, think of Elon Musk building new factories to build cars. That's a totally different thing than a consumer just buying more stuff. So when it's investors, there's an increase in aggregate demand. When it's I, it shifts here. But SROS doesn't shrink. SROS now is enabled to supply more. And so we went from here to A to B. And now there's an increase in SROS here, and we just grew the economy. And what happened is, this came through here, and here's our new LROS, and we have a bigger economy. It wasn't just a temporary little hot economy that then went back with a higher price level. This was a bigger economy. And you can think of times in our economy where we've had explosive growth. It's because of the entrepreneurial class. Think of the Industrial Revolution, probably be a great example of that. The dot-com boom. There was business expansion going on. Our economy was actually doing this also prior to the pandemic. We had a lot of economic growth. And so this right here, what I just drew, this is the PPF growing. We want a bigger PPF. Versus this one, this is just sort of, you were just hot for a second and came back. Okay, so these are the difference. So for part 2 of the question, part 2 is saying, what is the long-run effect on potential real GDP? It's going to get bigger. And so you could even say, use your shorthand again, you could say, oh, well, a decrease in interest rates leads to an increase in I, which leads to an increase in aggregate demand, which leads to an increase in real GDP, which leads to an increase in LROS. That would all make sense right there, but we're going to use the other phrase they love. Not only do they love interest-sensitive spending, but for this part right here, they like to hear the term capital formation. So I'm just going to say on my explanation, I'm going to say low interest rates leads to an increase in investment and capital formation. Leading to an increase in aggregate demand and real GDP. Done. Don't even have to talk about the LROS, they don't ask. Okay? And that's that. So number 2, kind of a short question, but definitely important concepts. And we didn't have to draw this or anything, I was just showing it. So the graph you had to make was the loanable funds market and understanding the impact of interest rates. So it doesn't matter if they're low from the loanable funds market or if they're low from monetary policy. The guts of understanding macro is, what's the impact of interest rates on an economy? And it's this graph right here. We want businesses to invest and expand and grow the economy and give everybody else a place to work. Okay? So, really emphasizing the power of the entrepreneur. All right, there is question number 2. And now it's time for 3. All right, question number 3 says, countries face trade-offs between producing consumer goods and producing capital goods. Country X takes 1 hour to produce a unit of consumer goods and 2 hours to produce a unit of capital goods. Country Y takes 2 hours to produce a unit of consumer goods and 4 hours to produce a unit of capital goods. Which country has comparative advantage? So this is a trade table question, but it's a little bit unusual. Again, wonderful creativity of country X and Y, and they couldn't even handle coming up with a consumer good. They just called it consumer good and capital good. So it's a trade table that's about as bland as it gets, and we just have to draw it and figure it out. So let's. I'm going to put A right here, and let's draw a trade table. And you don't need to. The trade table is not like a required thing or anything. It's just a useful tool. So remember, we're going to have 3 rows and 3 columns here. All right. And we have country X and we have country Y. And the 2 things we're making are consumer goods and capital goods. All right. Now it says country X takes 1 hour. Now you got to be careful because this question is talking about the amount of time to produce. Therefore, it's an input question. Okay. That's the trick on this one. It is input. All right. So, remember for input, the shortcut is IOU. Other goes under. So we'll be dividing instead of, dividing from the other one going under instead of in the numerator. So, let's see what we have here. It says it takes 1 hour to produce a unit of consumer goods. So, for country X, I'm going to move this to the left. It takes 1 hour to make that. And it takes 2 hours to produce a unit of capital goods. Okay? Then it says for country Y, it takes 2 hours to produce a consumer good, and it takes 4 hours to produce a capital good. All right, we've got what we need. Let's just find our advantages, and we'll go from there. All right, so I'm going to say other goes under, so it looks like 1 consumer good is costing me half of a capital good. And then it'll be the reciprocal over here. So 1 capital good is equal to 2 consumer goods. All right, now down here, 1 consumer good, other goes under, is 2/4, which reduces to half. This is strange. And we have 1 capital good is equal to 2 consumer goods. Huh. This is interesting. Well, sometimes this happens. It's unusual, but it does happen. And what you're noticing is it looks like country Y must just be a bigger country or a bigger economy. They have the absolute advantage in both. And maybe it's just because they're bigger. But the opportunity cost, they're equal. So no one has a comparative advantage here at all. So they wouldn't make very good trading partners. They should just make the things themselves. So it says, which country has a comparative advantage in the production of a consumer good? Explain. Well, my explanation would be neither. Well, my statement would be neither, and then my explanation would be both countries have equal opportunity cost. To produce capital goods. And you could just write 1 consumer good or half a capital. Okay, that'd be fine. Let's move on to letter B. Put that up here. So they give us a table here, and we've got a question about employment here. And so they give us there's 180,000 people employed in this country. So this is for country X. Frictionally unemployed are 10,000. So remember, frictionally is the healthy part of an economy, people retiring, people entering the job market, people changing jobs. Structurally unemployed, their skills went away, won't be back. Those jobs are different, the classic, the VCR repairman, the travel agent, that type of thing. And the cyclically unemployed is the bad one, and that's because your economy is not doing well. Okay? So it looks like we have 180,000 people working, 10,000 people friction, another 5 structural, another 5 cyclic, and then 100,000 not in the labor force. Now remember, these people could be students, they could be institutionalized, they could be stay-at-home moms, they could be who knows what. Okay, but here's our whole population. All right, so what they want to know is to calculate the unemployment rate. Okay, so just got to be careful here. Let's go ahead and write this down. So here's our formula. Okay, so for the unemployment, this is not a difficult question, but if you don't remember the formula, it's impossible. All right, so the unemployment rate is going to equal, your denominator is going to be your labor force. How many people are in your labor force? So that's why we're not counting the 100,000 that are not in it. And then your numerator is the people that are unemployed. So for example, you guys are not a part of the labor force because you're students. So you guys not working is not screwing this up. So the unemployment rate for this example, we just need to look at it. We say, okay, what's the labor force? You got to make sure you get that right. So the labor force is clearly the people that are working. But these people are all a part of the labor force. They don't have a job. So I have this 180,000 plus this 10,000 plus this 5 plus this 5. They give us a pretty nice number. Our labor force is 200,000 people. Okay? And now how many people are actually unemployed? Now the type doesn't matter here. We've got 10, 15, 20,000 people not working. Okay? Not working but looking for jobs. Okay, so they're not trying to trick you here. We got 20,000 over 200,000, we knock this off, we get 1/10 or 10%. So there it is. Now for part C, it says calculate the labor force participation rate. So how many people in your country are participating in the labor force? Okay, so if you want to find a labor force participation rate, so I'll just say labor force participation rate, LFPR, is equal to your population, so how many people are in your country, and then your labor force is your numerator. Okay, and this vacillates from time to time, and sometimes it's the people not in the labor force. There's usually reasons why they're not in the labor force. Sometimes we have a surge in college students, and that vacillates back and forth, and that's going to affect it. So for this one, we're going to have to just look at our population. So according to the problem, we had this 180 plus 10 plus 5 and 5. There's 200,000, but we have another 100,000 that are not. They're residents of the country, but they're just not in the labor force. But they're a part of the population, obviously. So we have 300,000 people in our population. Okay, and so I'm just going to do 300,000 in our population, and then how many people are actually in the labor force? Well, that's everybody else. They're in the labor force. They're not all working, but they're in the force. So that's the 200,000. So this reduces to 2/3, and as a percent, that would be 66.6 repeating percent. Okay, which isn't too far off. About 2/3 of the population is usually in it. Also, remember they're not in the labor force, retired people as well. So that was just, did you know your vocab? That was kind of a vocab check. Okay. Then part D says, draw a correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities curve for country X with consumer goods on the horizontal, capital on the vertical. Indicate a point on your graph labeled Z that reflects the current level of unemployment. Okay, so we have D here. So you can say, okay, I have to draw a PPF. You do that when you can do a straight one. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't tell you what kind of opportunity cost, whether it's increasing or constant, so that doesn't really matter. But it says, so this is for country X, and so this is our production possibilities curve for country X, and it says the horizontal is consumer. So I'll put con goods here, and so that means the vertical is capital goods, so I'm just going to write cap goods here. Okay. And then it says, indicate a point in your graph labeled Z that reflects the current level of unemployment. Well, we have to go back to here, and if you recall, frictionally and structurally unemployed is fine. It's a healthy part of an economy. The bad one is the cyclically unemployed. When you hear cyclical, it actually would be really good if you remembered the business cycle. For cyclical, down here, you guys, this is bad news. Down here is recession category. We don't like that. And when you have unemployment here, on the PPF, you're inside the curve. So just any point in here you could have picked and just said, well, that's Z. Because if you have cyclical unemployment, you're not at your potential. You're actually inside the curve. All right, and that's what they were testing you on. So, kind of a short question, little trade table, and then some vocab with unemployment and a PPF. So that was it. So that was question 3 and the last part of 2018 AP Macro. So thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.